He bought a dry oil well for 10 cents, then saw a $57 million secret rise from the ground. Fletcher Beaumont stared at the contract. His hands, usually steady enough to calibrate the most delicate surveying equipment, were trembling. 10 cents. That's all the banker Clyde Baxter wanted for it. An abandoned oil well, sitting on a patch of worthless sun-baked dirt that hadn't produced a single drop of crude in 7 years. Everybody in 3 territories knew the Baxter well was a bust, a monument to failure. So why was Clyde Baxter, a man who'd foreclose on his own mother for a nickel, practically giving it away? Fletcher's engineering mind, the same mind that had laid out miles of perfect track for the railroad, was screaming. Warning bells were going off, loud and clear. The banker's hands were shaking worse than his. He kept pushing the papers across his mahogany desk, a little too eager, a little too fast. Clyde's eyes kept darting toward the window, like he was expecting company. Bad company. And then there was the most unsettling detail of all. The contract, lying there on the desk, already had Fletcher's name written on it. Penned in perfect cursive, as if the deal was done before he'd even walked through the door. This wasn't a sale. It was a setup. Fletcher knew it. But with creditors breathing down his neck and his reputation in tatters, he didn't have a choice. He signed the paper. For 10 cents, he bought himself a hole in the ground. The well just sat there on the horizon, a skeleton of weathered wood against the pale morning sky. It looked forgotten. But as Fletcher got closer, his boots crunching on the parched earth, he saw it. The thing that everyone else had missed. Fresh tool marks, deep deliberate gouges scraped into the wood around the opening. And the dirt that should have been packed hard after 7 years of sun and wind, was disturbed. Someone had been here, and they'd been here recently. Fletcher peered down into the darkness of the shaft. The morning sun hit something deep below, just for a second. A flash of reflected light. Something metallic. Something that had no business being at the bottom of a dry oil well. In that moment, Fletcher Beaumont realized he hadn't just bought a piece of land. He'd bought a secret. A secret that powerful men had worked very, very hard to keep buried. The question wasn't why the well was dry. The real question was what was hidden at the bottom, and why they were so desperate to make sure it stayed there forever. Fletcher walked the perimeter of his new property, if you could call it that. His boots raised little puffs of dust with every step. The sun was climbing, casting long, skeletal shadows across the cracked earth. He pulled the tools from his satchel, the polished brass and steel instruments that were the last remnants of his old life. The life before the railroad contracts dried up, before the whispers of failure started following him from town to town. These tools had made him the most sought-after engineer in the West. Now, they were all he had left. The well stood there, listing slightly, a tired old man leaning into the wind. He approached it with the kind of methodical caution that had saved his life more than once on a dangerous survey. He knelt, running his fingers over the wooden frame. The scratches weren't just scratches. They were deep. Fresh. Couldn't be more than a few weeks old. "Someone's been busy," he murmured, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness of the plains. He uncoiled a weighted rope, the kind he used for measuring depths, and lowered it into the blackness. He counted the feet as the rope spooled through his hands. 10 feet, 20, 30, 40. At 42 feet, the rope went slack. He pulled it up, hand over hand. The end was wet. He sniffed it. Not the familiar pungent smell of oil. Just water. Clean, clear water. His engineer's mind went into overdrive. A dry oil well shouldn't have a pool of water at the bottom. Not at this depth, not in this geology. It was impossible, unless someone had been pumping it in, deliberately. He rigged up a small pulley, tied his lantern to the rope, and began lowering the light into the shaft. The circle of light descended, pushing back the darkness. 10 feet down. 15. At 20 feet, the light caught something. something that made his breath catch in his throat and his heart hammer against his ribs. Metal pipes, brand new metal pipes, gleaming in the lantern light. They ran down the side of the shaft wall, secured with new brackets, disappearing into the darkness below. These weren't part of any oil drilling operation. They were installed recently. And they led right down to whatever had flashed in the sunlight. A horse's nicker shattered the silence. Fletcher looked up, his hand instinctively going to the small pistol he kept tucked in his belt. A rider was approaching. A woman. She sat on her horse with an easy confidence, her dark hair pulled back under a worn hat. She dismounted, her boots making no sound on the soft dirt. Her dress was practical, her face weathered by the sun. This was a woman who worked the land, not just owned it. "You must be the fool who bought Baxter's cursed ground," she said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it carried a warning, clear as a church bell on a Sunday morning. Fletcher stood, brushing the dust from his trousers. "Fletcher Beaumont. And you are?" "Willa Blaine," she said, her eyes fixed on the well. "That belonged to my father, before Baxter cheated him out of it." Fletcher saw the pain in her eyes then, an old deep hurt that hadn't faded with the years. "What happened to your father?" he asked, his voice gentle. Willa's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in her cheek. "Same thing that happens to anyone who gets too close to what's really down there." She glanced around, a flicker of fear in her eyes, as if the empty land itself was listening. "You seem like a decent man, Mr. Beaumont. Take my advice. Fill that hole with dirt, get on your horse, and ride away. Don't look back." But Fletcher couldn't walk away. Every instinct, every bit of his training, told him he was standing on the edge of something immense. The tool marks, the water, the pipes. It was a puzzle, and engineers can't leave puzzles unsolved. "What aren't you telling me, Miss Blaine?" he pressed. Willa swung back onto her horse, her knuckles white where she gripped the reins. "Ask yourself why a man like Clyde Baxter was so desperate to sell," she said, her voice low and urgent. "And then ask yourself why he's been riding past your property every single morning since you signed that deed." She didn't wait for an answer. She spurred her horse, galloping away and leaving Fletcher alone with the silence, the questions, and the dark hole in the ground that held all the answers. He now knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the only person interested in what was hidden 42 feet below the surface. Fletcher spent the rest of the day pretending to work. He set up his surveying equipment, took meaningless measurements, and made notes in his journal. But his eyes never left the horizon. He was waiting. Just as Willa had said, as the sun began to bleed across the western sky, a lone rider appeared. Clyde Baxter. The banker rode with a stiff, unnatural posture, trying to look casual, but his eyes were devouring every inch of the property. Fletcher melted into the shadow of the well's wooden frame, watching through the slats. Baxter dismounted, tethered his horse, and walked directly to the well. He knelt, fumbled with a loose board near the base that Fletcher hadn't noticed, and pulled something from the hiding spot. A key. A key to a property he no longer owned. The banker used it to unlock a small, flat metal box hidden in the same recess. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. From the box, Baxter pulled out a sheaf of papers and a small, leather-bound journal. He stood up, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the documents. He studied them, his face growing paler and paler in the fading light. "The measurements are wrong," Baxter muttered, his voice a frantic whisper that carried on the evening air. "They should have reached it by now." Fletcher's mind raced, connecting the dots. The well wasn't just a secret project, it was a dead drop. A place to store documents. Documents with measurements, calculations, the fresh tool marks, the strange pipes, the water. It was all part of a plan that was failing. Baxter began pacing, counting his steps, his eyes glued to the drawings in his hand. He stopped about 15 feet from the well, knelt again, and pressed his ear to the ground. He stayed like that for a full minute, listening. Then he shot to his feet, his face transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a wild, feverish excitement. "It's still there," he breathed, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "After all these years, it's still there." That was enough. Fletcher made his move. He stepped out from behind the well, clearing his throat loudly. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. Baxter spun around, dropping the papers in a startled heap. His face cycled through a dozen emotions before landing on a sickly shade of yellow. "Mr. Baxter," Fletcher said, his voice calm and level. "Interesting time for a social call," the banker stammered, his eyes wide. "Beaumont, I was just checking on some old survey work. A sentimental visit." Fletcher started walking slowly toward the scattered papers, watching as Baxter instinctively moved to block him. "Survey work that requires a hidden key and secret visits after sundown?"
"You don't understand," Baxter said, his voice rising in desperation. "This is bigger than you. There are people involved. People who don't like interference." But it was too late. Fletcher bent down, his eyes locking with Baxter's, and plucked one of the fallen papers from the dust. His trained engineer's eye took it all in at a glance. It was a geological survey map, marked with precise depths and angles. But the mineral notations weren't for oil. They were for something else entirely. All. The symbol for gold. "Rich veins of gold," Fletcher said, the pieces snapping together with an audible click in his mind. "Running directly beneath this well." "You've been using my well as a marker," Fletcher continued, the full scope of the deception flooding through him. "The pipes, the water. You weren't drilling for oil. You've been trying to tunnel, to access a massive gold deposit." Baxter's hand twitched, drifting down toward the pistol holstered at his hip. "Put that paper down, Beaumont. You're in way over your head." But Fletcher wasn't looking at the gun. His eyes were fixed on a small, faded notation in the corner of the map. The name of the original surveyor. A name that made the blood in his veins run cold. Josiah Blaine, Willa's father. Fletcher looked up, his gaze locking with the terrified banker's. "What did you do to Josiah Blaine?" Before Baxter could answer, before he could draw his gun, his hand froze. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the plain. A second rider, emerging from the twilight, moving fast. The newcomer reined in his horse, dismounting in a single fluid motion. His face was grim in the lantern light, his eyes hard as stone. "Put the gun away, Clyde," the stranger said. His voice was low and carried the easy authority of a man used to giving orders. "We've got bigger problems than one nosy engineer." Fletcher sized up the new arrival. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak. His clothes were simple, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Jasper Creed," Baxter ground out through his teeth. "What are you doing here?" "Same thing you are," Jasper replied, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "Trying to clean up the mess you made 7 years ago." Jasper's eyes landed on Fletcher, taking in the survey map in his hand and the raw tension in the air. "Mr. Beaumont, I presume. Looks like we need to talk." Fletcher didn't move. He stood his ground, the well at his back, his mind calculating angles, distances, escape routes. "Talk about what?" he asked, his voice steady. "About what you did to Josiah Blaine?" Jasper's face darkened. "Among other things." He turned his hard gaze on the banker. "Tell him, Clyde. It's over. Tell him what we did." Baxter looked like he was going to be sick. "Jasper, we agreed. We agreed we'd never speak of it." "That was before his daughter started poking around again," Jasper shot back. "Before you got spooked and sold this land to the one man in the territory smart enough to figure it out." Jasper took a step toward Fletcher, his expression a mixture of grim resignation and something that looked like regret. "Josiah Blaine found what you found tonight, Beaumont.
A vein of gold so rich it would make us all kings. He wanted to file a proper claim, do it by the book. Fletcher's grip tightened on the map. And you didn't. Clyde here, Jasper said, nodding at the trembling banker. He convinced us we could get it out quiet. No government men, no taxes, just a few of us, splitting the fortune. Blaine refused, Fletcher finished for him, the ugly truth settling in his stomach like a lead weight. Worse, Jasper said, his voice barely a whisper. He threatened to go to the territorial authorities. He was an honest man. Baxter's voice finally returned, thin and reedy. We couldn't let him ruin it. Not for all of us. It was the chance of a lifetime. So, we made it look like an accident, Jasper said, his eyes now fixed on some distant point in the dark. A cave-in at the old silver mine where he was working. We buried him, and we buried the secret. The gold was here the whole time. We just spent 7 years trying to figure out how to get to it without anyone noticing. Fletcher felt the confession settle over him like a shroud. These men were murderers. They had killed for the gold that was sitting just 42 feet beneath his boots. The pipes, Fletcher said, his mind putting it all together. You've been trying to tunnel horizontally from the bottom of the shaft. Jasper nodded. For months. But we kept hitting unstable rock, flooding. Every time we got close, something went wrong. Baxter lost his nerve, wanted to cut his losses and sell the land, hoping nobody would ever look this close again. But you didn't expect me to be an engineer, Fletcher realized. Baxter let out a bitter, humorless laugh. We expected you to drill for oil, find nothing, and ride away broke. We didn't expect you to bring your fancy tools and start asking the right questions. Fletcher looked from one man to the other. His life had just taken a very sharp, very dangerous turn. He was standing on a $57 million secret, and he was standing between 2 men who had already killed to protect it. So, he asked, letting the silence stretch. What happens now? Jasper and Clyde exchanged a look. A long, silent conversation passed between them. It was the kind of look shared by men who have crossed a dark line together and know they might have to do it again. Now, Jasper said, his voice dangerously quiet. We discuss terms. But Fletcher was already moving, already calculating. 2 men, 1 gun he could see, and a 42-foot hole right behind him. The real question was, could he trust either of them? The answer came a second later. The distinct metallic click of a rifle being cocked in the darkness just beyond the lantern's glow. Nobody moves. The voice that cut through the night was a woman's. Willa Blaine stepped out of the darkness and into the ring of light. She was holding a long-barreled rifle, and it was aimed squarely at Jasper Creed's chest. Her hands were rock-steady. Her face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. I've been waiting 7 years to hear that confession. Jasper raised his hand slowly, palms out. Willa, now hold on. Put the weapon down. We can work this out. The way you worked things out with my father? Her voice was laced with 7 years of pain and anger. I know what you did. I've always known. Fletcher saw his opening. The 3 of them were locked in their own private drama. This was his chance. But which way to go? Trust Willa, the grieving daughter with a rifle, or trust his own skills and get down that well, away from all of them? Miss Blaine, Fletcher said, his voice low and calm, trying not to make any sudden moves. How long have you known? Since the day they brought his body home from that so-called cave-in, she said, her eyes never leaving Jasper. My father was the most careful miner in this territory. He didn't die in accidents. He was murdered. Fletcher saw it out of the corner of his eye. A slight, furtive movement. Baxter! The banker's hand was slowly, almost imperceptibly, inching toward his pistol again. Willa was so focused on Jasper, she didn't see it. Willa! Fletcher yelled. Baxter! She swung the rifle toward the banker just as his hand closed around the butt of his gun. A shot exploded, deafening in the night air. But Fletcher was already gone. In the split second of chaos, he grabbed the thick rope he'd used for the lantern and launched himself into the black emptiness of the well. The descent was a controlled fall, a chaotic scramble in the dark. He wrapped the rope tight around his forearm, the friction burning his skin, using his boots to brace against the rough-hewn walls of the shaft to slow himself down. Above him, he heard shouting, another gunshot, and the frantic sound of horses. 40 feet down, his boots splashed into cold water. It came up to his knees. He was at the bottom. He waded through the flooded base, his hands searching in the darkness. He found the new metal pipes, just as he'd expected. But behind them, tucked into a recess carved into the wall, he felt something else. Wood. A crate. It was sealed with wax. His fingers, raw and shaking, worked at the seals. He pried the lid open. Inside, his hands found exactly what he expected. Heavy canvas bags filled with the unmistakable weight of raw gold nuggets. But there was something else. A leather portfolio, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp. He pulled it out, his heart pounding. Inside were more maps, more geological reports, and one document that made his blood freeze. It was a contract, dated 7 years ago. It detailed a partnership to illegally mine this land, and it was signed by 5 men. He recognized 2 names immediately, Jasper Creed and Clyde Baxter. The third was Josiah Blaine, his signature looking forced, unsteady. But it was the 4th and 5th signatures that changed everything. The 4th name belonged to another local rancher he knew. But the 5th? The 5th name belonged to Judge Morrison Blackwood, the highest legal authority in the territory. The very man who had presided over the official inquiry into Josiah Blaine's death and ruled it an accident. Fletcher shoved the portfolio into his jacket, just as voices echoed from the top of the shaft. They were coming for him. The only way out was back up the rope. But now he held the proof. The proof that could bring down the most powerful men in the territory, if he could live long enough to use it. A lantern appeared at the top of the well, throwing his long, distorted shadow against the wet walls. A second rope snaked down beside him. "Come on up, Beaumont!" Jasper Creed's voice called down, thick with a false friendliness. "Let's talk about this like civilized men." But Fletcher heard another sound, fainter, in the distance. The unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses, approaching at a full gallop. He realized in that terrifying moment that everyone who wanted him dead was about to be in the same place, at the same time, right above his head. The approaching horses were getting closer, their hoofbeats like a drumbeat of doom. Fletcher knew he had seconds to make a choice. Climb Jasper's rope and walk into a trap, or find another way out. His engineer's mind, accustomed to seeing solutions where others saw walls, scanned the dark shaft. His hands ran along the pipes. They weren't just for pumping water or air. The way they were spaced, the brackets. They formed a ladder. A crude, slippery, vertical ladder to hell. He secured the portfolio inside his jacket, took a deep breath, and began to climb. The metal pipes were slick with condensation, and they groaned under his weight. Every upward pull was a struggle. He was climbing toward the men who wanted to kill him, but it was his only chance. "Fletcher!" Jasper's voice echoed down again, more urgent this time. "Those riders coming! That's Judge Blackwood's men. They're not here to talk. They're here to clean up loose ends. That includes you, me, and Clyde, if you don't get up here and help us." Fletcher kept climbing. He'd seen the contract. He knew Blackwood wasn't a victim. He was the mastermind. A cleanup meant eliminating every last witness, including his own bungling partners. 20 feet from the surface, he could hear their voices clearly. Willa was arguing, her voice sharp with defiance. Baxter was pleading, his voice a high, panicked whine. And over it all, the steady, thundering approach of at least 4 more horses. Fletcher pressed himself flat against the shaft wall as a new voice cut through the air. A voice he recognized from the territorial courtroom. It was deep, authoritative, and cold as a winter grave. "Gentlemen, Miss Blaine." It was Judge Morrison Blackwood. "I understand we have a situation that requires immediate resolution." "Judge," Baxter stammered, "we tried to handle it. We did. But Beaumont, he found the papers and you let him escape into the one place on this property where we stored every piece of incriminating evidence," Blackwood finished, his voice dangerously calm. Fletcher could hear the rage simmering just beneath the surface. 7 years. 7 years of careful planning, and you two fools compromise everything in a single night. Fletcher kept climbing, slower now, every muscle straining as he tried to hear every word. "What do you want us to do?" Jasper asked, his voice subdued. "What we should have done the moment Beaumont signed that deed," Blackwood replied, his tone chilling. "Remove all witnesses, and then collapse the well. We'll make it look like an accident. Another tragic cave-in." Willa's voice rang out, clear and unafraid. "You'll never get away with it, Blackwood. Too many people know I came out here." "Miss Blaine," the judge said with a condescending chuckle, "your father thought the same thing. How did that work out for him?" Fletcher was now just 10 feet from the top, hidden in the shadows just below the lip of the well. He could see their silhouettes against the night sky. Men were moving, positioning themselves around the opening. "Bring the charges," Blackwood commanded. "We'll bring down enough rock and timber to seal this shaft for a century. Whatever is down there, and whoever is down there, stays down there." Fletcher's blood ran cold. They weren't just going to kill him, they were going to bury him alive. He scrambled up the last few feet of pipe, his fingers screaming in protest. He could hear the heavy thud of wooden crates being set down near the wellhead. Mining charges. He was out of time. But then, just as the first of Blackwood's men began to unspool the wires, another voice spoke from the darkness. A voice that stopped everyone dead in their tracks. "I don't think so, Morrison." It was a woman, but it wasn't Willa. This voice held a different kind of authority, and it was followed by the sound of at least a dozen rifles being cocked in unison. "Territorial Marshal Davidson sends her regards," the woman continued, stepping into the lantern light. "And a warrant for your arrest." The standoff above ground exploded into pure chaos. The sharp crack of a rifle, then another, shattered the night. Shouts, curses, the sound of men scrambling for cover. Fletcher used the bedlam to haul himself over the edge, rolling away from the well and into the darkness just as a bullet whizzed past his head, splintering the wood where he'd been moments before. He was out of the well, but he'd climbed straight into the middle of a firefight. Marshal Davidson's deputies had taken up positions in a wide semicircle, using rocks and the sparse brush for cover. They had Blackwood's men pinned down, but the judge had come prepared. His men were firing back from behind a heavy supply wagon they'd brought for the demolition work. Fletcher crawled behind a stack of lumber, his heart hammering. He could see Willa, crouched behind a large boulder, her rifle still in her hands, but she was trapped by the crossfire. "Beaumont!" It was Marshal Davidson, her voice cutting through the gunfire. She was positioned behind a cluster of rocks not 20 yards away. "Are you armed?" "No!" Fletcher shouted back, pulling the oilskin portfolio from his jacket. "But I have the proof you need!" Judge Blackwood must have heard him. "Kill him!" the judge roared from behind the wagon. "Don't let him reach the marshal!" One of Blackwood's men, Jasper Creed, broke from cover. He ran low, zigzagging toward Fletcher's position, his pistol drawn. But Willa was waiting for him. Her rifle cracked once. Jasper cried out, stumbling, clutching a bloody shoulder. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees. "That's for my father," Willa said, her voice grim and steady. That was the opening Fletcher needed. He broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground toward Marshal Davidson, the portfolio clutched to his chest like a shield. Dirt kicked up around his feet as bullets tore through the space where he'd just been. He dove behind the rocks, landing hard beside the marshal. Marshal Davidson was a tough-looking woman in her 40s, with streaks of gray in her hair and eyes that had seen everything. She never took her rifle off the wagon. "What have you got, engineer?" she asked, her voice calm despite the bullets whizzing overhead. Fletcher ripped open the portfolio and explained everything, his words tumbling out in a rush. The contract, the surveys, the 5 signatures, Judge Blackwood's name tying him not just to the gold, but to the murder of Josiah Blaine. "This is it," Davidson said, a grim smile touching her lips. "We've been investigating corruption in the territorial court for months, ever since we heard whispers about Blackwood. This document nails him to the wall." A fresh volley of shots erupted from the wagon. Blackwood was getting desperate, but he was outgunned and outmaneuvered. "Judge Morrison Blackwood!" Marshal Davidson yelled, her voice booming across the battlefield. "You are surrounded. Surrender now, and you will be treated in accordance with territorial law." There was a long silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded Jasper Creed. Then Blackwood's voice, filled with rage and disbelief, echoed from behind the wagon. "I have spent 7 years building an empire in this territory. I will not see it end because of a dead miner, 2 greedy fools, and 1 nosy engineer." Fletcher watched as Judge Blackwood stepped out from behind the wagon. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a lit stick of dynamite. His face was a mask of pure, desperate fury. "If I can't have the gold, then nobody can," he screamed. "This well and everyone around it ends tonight." Fletcher's mind, always calculating, instantly processed the blast radius. The dynamite would kill everyone within 50 feet. It would collapse the well, burying the evidence, the gold, and all of them forever. But Willa Blaine had already done the same calculation. Without a moment's hesitation, she stood up from behind her boulder, raised her rifle, and fired. The shot was perfect. It hit Blackwood in the wrist. The dynamite flew from his grasp, tumbling end over end through the air, its fuse sputtering, heading straight for the opening of the well. Fletcher didn't think. He reacted. All his training, all his knowledge of angles and trajectories, took over. He launched himself from behind the rocks, diving toward the falling explosive. He caught it in midair, a foot from the ground, the burning fuse searing his palm. With a desperate roar, he scrambled to his feet and hurled the dynamite with all his strength. It sailed out into the darkness, away from the well, away from the people. It landed in the empty field 100 yards away and detonated with a deafening boom that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The night fell silent. The only sound was the ringing in their ears. Judge Morrison Blackwood stood in the lantern light, clutching his shattered wrist, surrounded by the stern faces of Marshal Davidson's deputies. His fight was over. His conspiracy was in ruins. But Fletcher knew, as he looked at the defeated judge's face, that the most dangerous moments often come after the shooting stops, when a powerful man has nothing left to lose. 3 weeks later, Fletcher stood on the same piece of land, but it was transformed. A crew of territorial mining engineers were carefully extracting the first core samples from the vein. The glint of raw gold in the rock was unmistakable. The geological surveys hadn't lied. It was one of the richest deposits ever found in the territory. Down in the capital, Judge Blackwood was in a prison cell, awaiting a trial that was a mere formality. The evidence Fletcher had pulled from the well was ironclad. Jasper Creed and Clyde Baxter, facing their own grim futures, had confessed to everything in exchange for a chance at seeing daylight again in a decade or 2. Marshal Davidson rode up, her horse kicking up dust. She was holding an official-looking document with a large wax seal. "Mr. Beaumont, news from the governor." Fletcher took the heavy paper. It was a formal commendation, recognizing his courage in exposing a level of corruption that had poisoned the territory for years. "There's more," Davidson said, a small smile on her face. "The mining authority has released its initial assessment. That vein runs for nearly half a mile. At current market prices, you're looking at a value of somewhere around $57 million. The number didn't seem real. Fletcher felt it wash over him, a dizzying wave of disbelief. 6 months ago, he was a bankrupt engineer, his name synonymous with failure. Now, he was one of the richest men in the West. What about the ownership? Fletcher asked, the legal complexities swirling in his mind. Blackwood and the others had claims. All invalidated, Davidson said firmly. Obtained through fraud, coercion, and murder. The territorial court has already ruled. You, Mr. Beaumont, as the legal owner who uncovered the crime, hold clear and complete title to this land and all its mineral rights. Just then, another rider approached. It was Willa Blaine. She dismounted with that same easy grace, but the deep-seated pain in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. Justice for her father had finally lifted the weight she'd carried for 7 long years. The prosecutor wants to see you tomorrow, she told Fletcher. They're finalizing the case against Blackwood. Your testimony is the last piece they need. Fletcher nodded. I'll be there. Your father deserves to have the full story told. Willa looked out at the mining operation, at the engineers working carefully under the watchful eye of the law. He would have been proud, she said softly, to see it done right. Legal claims, proper surveys, everything out in the open. Speaking of doing things right, Fletcher said. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper. I had the attorneys in the Capitol draw this up. He handed it to Willa. It was a legal partnership agreement. It gave her a 25% share of all profits from the mine. As Josiah Blaine's only heir, Fletcher believed she was owed a share of the discovery her father had died to protect. Willa read the document, her eyes wide. She read it again, the numbers sinking in. 25% of $57 million. It was a fortune beyond her wildest dreams. Fletcher, I can't, she whispered. This is too much. You're not accepting a gift, Willa, Fletcher said, his voice firm. You're accepting justice. Your father found this gold. He died trying to do the right thing. It's only right that his family should benefit from his discovery. She looked from the paper in her hand to the mine, then back to Fletcher. A long moment passed. Then she smiled, a real, genuine smile, and extended her hand. Partners, then, she said. But we do this my father's way. Legal, honest, and fair. Fletcher shook her hand, sealing a deal that would not only change both of their lives, but would also become a symbol of how sometimes the truth really does find its way out of the darkness. 6 months after that night of fire and dynamite, Fletcher Beaumont stood in the sprawling main office of the Beaumont and Blaine Mining Company. The quarterly production reports on his desk told a staggering story. The $57 million estimate had been conservative. The vein was bigger, richer, and deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. He wore a tailored suit now, the uniform of a successful businessman, but his engineer's mind was still the sharpest tool he owned. His desk was littered with correspondence from investors, equipment manufacturers, and territorial tax officials. The broke, desperate man who had gambled 10 cents on a worthless well was gone. In his place was an industrialist who employed over 200 men and supplied gold to banks across the frontier. A knock on the door, and Willa came in. Her own transformation was just as remarkable. As his partner, she had become a force in her own right, one of the most respected businesswomen in the territory. She used her wealth and influence not for herself, but to fund a legal aid foundation for families who, like hers once had, found themselves powerless against corrupt men. The final appeals were denied, she said, a note of quiet satisfaction in her voice. Blackwood will die in prison. Jasper and Baxter got 15 years each. Justice was complete. The men who had murdered her father had finally faced the consequences. What about the other properties? Fletcher asked, looking at a large map on the wall. Marshal Davidson has identified 3 other sites where Blackwood's cronies were running illegal surveys, Willa reported. The land is being returned to the rightful owners. Fletcher walked to the window, looking down at the massive, orderly mining operation below. The well, the place where it all began, now served as the central ventilation shaft for the most advanced gold mine in the West. "Sometimes I think about that night," Fletcher said quietly. "How close we all came to being buried down there with that secret." Willa stood beside him at the window. "My father always said the truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep you try to bury it." Fletcher smiled. In this case, it literally rose from the ground. The conspiracy to hide the gold had been destroyed by the very place they used to hide it. "So, what's next for the company?" Willa asked. "Expansion," Fletcher replied, his eyes on the horizon. "But we do it responsibly. Legal claims, fair wages, honest partnerships. We build something your father would have been proud of." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over his empire, Fletcher reflected on the incredible journey. He had bought a dry oil well for 10 cents. In return, he had found not just a fortune in gold, but something far more valuable. He had found justice for a good man, a partnership with a strong woman, and the simple, unshakable truth of doing the right thing. The 10-cent investment had made him a millionaire. But more than that, it had restored honor to a murdered man's name and brought justice to those who thought they were above it. Fletcher Beaumont, the engineer who had been written off as a failure, was finally the man he was always meant to be. If you enjoyed this incredible story of justice and discovery, then click the video on your screen right now for another unforgettable tale of courage and determination. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing frontier adventures. Your support helps us create these compelling tales of the Old West that you love to watch.